The AR-15. It's versatile, lightweight, and highly customizable. It's also very user-friendly, relatively affordable, and extremely popular among gun enthusiasts, especially in the United States. So much so that there's a joke that the AR stands for America's Rifle. But of course that's not where it comes from, and it doesn't mean assault rifle either. Rather, AR stands for Armalite, the company that produces the iconic weapon. But how did the AR-15 go from just another rifle to one of the most popular guns ever produced in the United States? The tale begins in the 1950s. The United States is about a decade removed from its pivotal role in helping the Allies to achieve victory during World War II, and it's established itself as the most powerful nation on the planet. However, there is a challenger to its throne, the Soviet Union. From crucial compatriots to the US and its allies in World War II, the Soviet Union quickly evolved into one of the greatest threats to the American way of life. That threat was born from ideology. Joseph Stalin's interpretation of communism stacked against the democratic and capitalistic concepts that formed the backbone of the US. That ideological clash led to the Cold War, a period of bitter opposition between the US and the Soviet Union that began almost as soon as World War II ended and ran for most of the 20th century. And it was against this backdrop that a soft-spoken and self-taught inventor named Eugene Stoner began to work on what would become both the most beloved and most hated gun in American history. Born in Gosport, Indiana in 1922, Stoner's early career took him to the Vega Aircraft Company, where he worked installing armaments. That early taste of working with weaponry would serve him well later in his career, but he first had to deal with the fact that he was of fighting age when World War II rolled around. Stoner did not shy away or wait to be drafted. Rather, he enrolled in the U.S. Marine Corps, becoming an aviation ordnance specialist serving in the South Pacific and northern China. Upon the war's end, Stoner would spend the next 9 years working in a Whitaker-owned machine shop. It wasn't until 1954 that he made a career decision that would change the course of American rifles forever. He began working at Armalite. Back then a division of Fairchild Engine and Airplane Corporation, Armalite likely hired Stoner because of his extensive experience working with aircraft. Yet that's not where his focus lay. Stoner began working on several of the forerunners to the rifle that would become so important to American history, building an array of prototypes, many of which never reached full production runs. His AR-3, AR-4, AR-11, and AR-12 designs would all meet this fate, consigned to the dustbin of history, though also serving as crucial stepping stones toward the creation of the AR-15. However, he saw success with other rifles before the AR-15 was released. The AR-5 is an excellent example. Weighing just 2.5 pounds, this bolt-action rifle fired 22 Hornet rounds, which were fed into it using a 5-round detachable box. For a brief time, it served the needs of the U.S. Air Force, which was on the lookout for a compact and lightweight rifle that was also accurate, so it could place it into the survival kits of XB-70 crew members. Armalite and Stoner designed the AR-5 to meet that need. Impressed by the rifle, the U.S. Air Force quickly adopted it in 1956, rebranding it as the MA-1 to pack it into the survival kits of all the XB-70 crew members. Stoner had his first success, though it would be short-lived. The cancellation of the XB-70 fleet soon after the rifle's adoption meant that the Air Force never ordered any beyond the initial 12 test models it packed into kits, with the rifle being taken out of active service in 1959. Still, Stoner had proof that the military could accept his designs. More success would come with the AR-10. Iterating on his previous designs, the AR-10 became an early jewel in the Armalite crown. A tactical rifle with a 16-inch barrel, it was chambered to accept the 7.62 by 51mm NATO rounds, yet was still light and compact enough to be easily carried on the battlefield. At just 8.5 pounds, it was easily transportable, and the 25-round magazine included with the rifle gave anyone who used it plenty of firepower. It should have been a shoo-in for the U.S. Army adoption. And indeed, the Army tested the weapon extensively at its Aberdeen Proving Grounds in 1956. It was exceptionally well received, not least because of its size and collapsibility. Yet the U.S. Army went down another route. Rather than accepting the AR-10 as its new standard rifle, it selected the T-44, which became the M14, likely due to the later arrival of the AR-10 in the testing cycle. That might have been the end of the story for any other rifle. However, Armalite was able to license the AR-10 to a Dutch company named Artillerie Inrichtingen until 1960. The rifle was also purchased by several countries' militaries, including Portugal, Sudan, Italy, and Cuba, for limited use. Armalite had a winner, but it still didn't have a firearm that it could manufacture on a massive scale for the U.S. military. That would change soon enough. The U.S. Army had initially chosen the M14 to be the replacement for the famous M1 Garand. On paper, it seemed to fit the bill. Like the AR-10, it fired 7.62 by 51mm NATO rounds, with its 20-round magazine being just a few rounds short of that offered in the AR-10. It was also intended for dual use as a standard and automatic rifle. A soldier could switch it to fully automatic at any point to rattle off quick-fire rounds against the enemy. But by 1960, the M14 was already falling out of favor. It simply wasn't an ideal rifle for the Vietnam War. At 44.3 inches, it was a far longer rifle than many in that war required, especially as much of a soldier's time was spent patrolling jungle territory. It was also heavy, weighing in at 12.12 pounds with equipment, and its impressive 2,600-foot range wasn't able to compensate for its massive recoil. That recoil also made it difficult to use in full auto mode, with one writer for Gray's Sporting Journal noting that an ex-military colleague of his who had trained with the M14 claimed that firing in full auto with the rifle was the shooting equivalent to bull riding. Others went further. In a 1965 issue of Gun Digest, John LeChuck accused the M14 of being a money-grubbing rifle that symbolized everything that was wrong with America's supposed military-industrial complex of the time. He called it a monumental mechanical failure for U.S. Army ordnance, and predicted it would have the shortest shelf life of any rifle in the country's history. He was only partially right. Though the M14 soon fell out of favor for active deployment, it would gain a second lease on life as a training rifle. But by now, you're probably asking yourself a question. What does any of this have to do with the AR-15, or for that matter, the AR-10 that the U.S. Army rejected in favor of the M14? Well aware of the M14's relative failure in Vietnam, the U.S. Army approached Armalite with a proposition. It wanted a version of the AR-10 that had impressed so much during testing, only with a handful of adjustments. The new rifle should fire a .223 Remington cartridge. Stoner got to work following new firearm parameters that the U.S. Continental Army Command, or CONARC, had delivered to manufacturers in 1957. Several months after beginning development, Stoner was ready to provide a live-fire demonstration of a rifle that was still initially a modified AR-10, but would go on to become the AR-15. Stoner's prototype was impressive. The rifle had both semi-automatic and fully automatic settings, which would make it extremely useful in Vietnam, and shot rounds that traveled at supersonic speeds over the first 500 yards. Stoner also had modified the cartridge, taking the .223 Remington that CONARC required and tweaking it to the point where it was capable of penetrating solid steel up to a maximum range of 500 yards. Stoner's live testing was so encouraging that the U.S. Army, under the guidance of Commanding Army General Willard G. Wyman, ordered 80,000 units of the rifle, all chambered in .223, to replace the M14 as quickly as possible. Armalite had the rifle it needed, choosing to sell the AR-15s designed at Colt in 1959. 4 years later, the U.S. military chose Colt to manufacture enough AR-15s, which it had rebranded as the M16, to make it standard issue for soldiers in Vietnam. But it wasn't all smooth sailing for the AR-15 in its first full deployment. The Army's M16 versions of the rifles became notorious for jamming, with Neiman reports noting that changes made to the rifle as ordered by the Pentagon Committee were the most likely cause. Those changes led to the M16 being incompatible with certain types of ammo used by U.S. troops in Vietnam, with Pointer arguing that many soldiers died in the country simply because their guns wouldn't fire. There were other problems. In their book Misfire: The Tragic Failure of the M16 in Vietnam, Bob Orkant and Lyman Duryea point out that the M16 was rushed through production by the military. Colt managed to keep up as well as implement the changes to Armalite's AR-15 design that the Pentagon requested, but the sheer scale of manufacturing likely led to the production of more defective models of the rifle than would otherwise have occurred. Soldiers on the ground in Vietnam were also misinformed about the rifle. Many received little to no training on how to maintain their new AR-15 variants, meaning degrading parts and issues that could cause misfires went unrecognized. Some didn't even bother to try to maintain their weapon. They'd been told that the M16 was a self-cleaning weapon. The alterations the Pentagon requested before shipping the AR-15 as the M16 also wreaked havoc on the rifle's chamber. A lack of chrome plating was unwise in a harsh and humid jungle environment, with many of the initial batches of M16 sent to Vietnam having chambers that eventually corroded due to the conditions. Then there was the ammunition issue mentioned earlier. Orkant and Duryea point out that the ammunition accompanying the versions of the AR-15 sent to Vietnam was incompatible with the rifle, hence the many jamming and misfiring issues. One officer called the M16 about as effective as a muzzleloader. Congress intervened. It investigated the rifle and ordered incremental modifications to both the AR-15 and the ammunition it used, finally getting it to a state where soldiers could rely on it to perform as expected. More training was also provided to the troops, but the M16's reputation had already been damaged. Many on the ground in Vietnam wouldn't trust the rifle for the rest of the war. At best, those early days of the AR-15 could be considered a mixed success. Yes, it had experienced issues once it was adopted and renamed the M16 for military use. However, those failures were not of Stoner or Armalite's making. Repeated changes made to the rifle by the Pentagon, combined with the rapid production schedule, contributed to the M16's downfall. Yet, despite this auspicious start, the AR-15 would gain a new lease on life once Vietnam ended. The reason why comes down to Colt. Once the Vietnam War ended, Colt could have quietly retired the M16, licking its wounds while working on a new rifle. It didn't do that. Instead, it expanded the production of the rifle by creating a semi-automatic version that was rebranded to the original AR-15 name. That version would be made available to both law enforcement and civilians. In truth, these commercially available models had already started to be developed while the Vietnam War was in progress, with the company releasing the Colt AR-15 in 1964. But it's around this point that the tale of the AR-15 starts to split down different paths. We'll start with Stoner. After the success of the AR-15, Stoner turned his attention to his next rifle iteration, the AR-16, a gas-operated selective fire rifle. It was designed to be sold to emerging nations that had minimal industrial bases. However, it failed. The early 1960s saw a brief marketing push for the gun, but the lack of buyers meant that the AR-16 never got beyond a couple of limited production runs. It would go on to form the basis of the far more successful AR-18, but that's a story for another video. As for Stoner, he left Armalite in 1961 and landed at Colt, which was the licensed manufacturer of the AR-15. He didn't spend long at the company, moving on to Cadillac Gage soon after, which is where he further built his reputation as an innovator in the rifle space, with the development of the Stoner 63 weapon system. An early modular weapon system, it could be configured to serve several functions, including an automatic rifle, light or medium machine gun, or a solenoid-fired fixed machine gun. That brings us back to the AR-15 being made available for public consumption. Colt's decision to develop a semi-automatic version of the rifle would have far-reaching consequences, especially once 1977 rolled around and their patent on the AR-15 ran out. By that point, they'd established the rifle as a popular seller. Though the M16 variant of the rifle experienced mixed fortunes during its time in Vietnam, Pointer notes that many soldiers who returned from that conflict bought AR-15s for themselves due to their similarity to the M16. The rifle was also helped by having a somewhat unique look for the time. Though the public-facing version was marketed as a hunting rifle, it was still designed to look like a military rifle. Again, that bolstered its popularity, even among those who hadn't served in the military, as did its lightweight and the fact that it's an extremely customizable rifle. Pointer says that some call the AR-15 the Lego of guns due to how easy it is to modify the AR-15 with accessories or even tinker with custom-made parts, a big selling point for gun enthusiasts. Colt benefited from all this popularity until 1977. Then, the AR-15 style rifles started entering the market. Though Colt retained the trademark of the AR-15 brand, the lapsing of the patent on the rifle in 1977 opened the door for other manufacturers to make rifles that were AR-15s in all but name. There are a dozen examples: the AAC Honey Badger, Barrett Rec 7, Heckler & Koch HK416, and Norinco CQ are all AR-style rifles that piggyback on the design of the original. These new rifles flooded the market so quickly that many weren't even referred to by the names their manufacturers gave them. They were and still are simply called AR-15s, even though they're technically not. That opening up of the manufacturing of the AR-15 likely boosted its popularity more than any other factor, though it wouldn't be a plain sailing for the rifle in the public domain from the late 70s onward. Controversy would soon engulf the rifle. In September 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the Public Safety and Recreational Firearms Use Protection Act, often referred to as the Federal Assault Weapons Ban, into law. The bill altered the federal criminal code so that it became illegal to manufacture, transfer, or possess a semi-automatic assault weapon. It also received widespread support, passing through the Senate with a vote of 95-4 in November 1993. That act named 12 guns specifically, with the AR-15 being one of them. For the next 10 years, the AR-15 in its original commercially available version was kept off the market. But it didn't disappear entirely. Part of that was down to a loophole in the federal assault weapons ban. Though the bill banned 12 specific rifles and several features built into guns, it couldn't possibly stop all of the modifications that could be made to weapons. It also wasn't a blanket ban on semi-automatic weapons, meaning these types of guns didn't exit the public consciousness entirely. However, and more specifically to the AR-15, the most important loophole was that it only applied to weapons, features, and large-capacity magazines on weapons developed after the bill became law. Any AR-15 or AR-15 style rifle produced before 1994 was still fair game. It's also important to note that the ban didn't apply to all AR-15 style rifles. While the original was pushed out of the picture, several similar rifles were still manufactured under the proviso that they had fewer than 2 military-like features and a magazine capacity of less than 10. The AR-15 didn't disappear entirely, but it became a poster child for the ban, leading to a stigma being attached to the rifle for many years to come. Another issue with the law was that it had a 10-year sunset period built into it. Once 2004 rolled around, Congress would need to reauthorize the ban to keep the law in power. It chose not to do so, once again making the AR-15 available for sale to the public after a decade of not being manufactured. According to Poynter, the U.S. underwent a cultural shift between 1994 and 2004, which likely led to the ban not being renewed. The country was still reeling from the impact of 9/11, and the wars were ongoing in Iraq and Afghanistan. Patriotism along with support for the military were at all-time highs, which favored those who wished to repeal the federal assault weapons ban. Some, such as Syracuse University professor Grant Rear, also point to video games as being pivotal in the AR-15's return to the market. He notes that the Call of Duty franchise started becoming popular around that same time as the ban was lifted, claiming you've got this whole new set of people that are playing these games and really getting into these rifles. And then they decide, you know what, I want the real thing. How accurate that claim may be is up for debate. However, 2005 served as a clarion call for the return of the AR-15 to the public domain. It was in that year that the Protection of Lawful Commerce Arms Act was passed, which essentially shields gun manufacturers from any civil action that results from the unlawful misuse of any of their products. In other words, AR-15 manufacturers could no longer be sued if somebody committed a crime with one of their products, which opened the door for marketing and manufacturing of the AR-15 at a higher level than ever before. Sales of the AR-15 skyrocketed, with Ryan Bussey, a policy advisor for the Giffords Gun Control Advocacy Group, noting how quick the turnaround was. By the time Obama was leading the polls in 2007, the AR-15 was starting to become the poster child both of industry growth. The AR-15 had ascended to become America's rifle, a name apparently given to it by the National Rifle Association. The AR-15's popularity had only boomed since the ban was lifted. Between 1994 and 2004, the time when the sale of AR-15s was banned, the rifle accounted for no more than 3.7% of all guns built in the U.S. A near constant uptick in sales has occurred since then. From 2005 to 2020, the AR-15 and similar style rifles have gone from accounting for 4.6% of all firearms production in the U.S. to a staggering 23.4%, a remarkable feat for a rifle that was so vilified throughout the 90s. Still, the AR-15 is not free from controversy, even if it's no longer subject to a federal ban. The lack of a federal ban doesn't stop states from implementing their own laws to ban the AR-15 or similar assault weapons. U.S. Concealed Carry notes that 11 states have such bans in place: California, New York, Washington, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, Washington, D.C., Illinois, Maryland, Hawaii, and Massachusetts. Others, such as Minnesota and Virginia, have strict training and background checks in place for potential gun owners to pass before they can get an AR-15. The rifle's journey has certainly been an interesting one. Its origins as an innovative rifle developed by Eugene Stoner led to its widespread adoption under the M16 name in the U.S. military. It's still a part of the military today, having served as the standard issue rifle for almost 6 decades. Granted, the M16 is reaching the end of its lifespan. The Marine Corps has already replaced it with the M27 IAR, with the SIG Spear set to supplant the M16 for the U.S. Army in the coming years. Still, no other rifle can boast the sheer staying power of the M16, at least not in the American military. The AR-15 has a more mixed reputation on the civilian and commercial side. To some, it's America's rifle, a symbol of the country's ingenuity and a firearm anybody should be proud to own. To others, it's a symbol of everything that's wrong with gun culture in the U.S. One thing is for certain: The AR-15 is a remarkable feat of engineering that has endured thanks to the ease of use and versatility. Stoner crafted something special in the 1960s, with even modern rifles often struggling to match the effectiveness of the AR-15. But what do you think? Is the AR-15 unfairly maligned in some quarters or overly celebrated in others? Why do you think the rifle has managed to become so popular and sustain its popularity even with repeated efforts to ban it? Let us know what you think in the comments. Now check out most insane weapons the US military is actually using today, or watch this video instead.